In 2003, a 27-year-old travel blogger named Evan Marshall set out on an ambitious solo expedition deep into the Amazon rainforest. His goal was simple yet bold: to document life in one of the most untouched regions of the world for his growing online audience. Back then, travel vlogs were rare, and Evan's handheld camera was his only connection to the outside world. He had filmed abandoned villages, hidden rivers, and tribes untouched by modern civilization. But after one final entry uploaded from a remote outpost near the Peruvian border, Evan disappeared without a trace. Search teams scoured the dense jungle for weeks. Helicopters hovered over the canopies, and local guides traced his last known coordinates. But there were no footprints, no camp remains, nothing. The forest had simply swallowed him whole. Eventually, authorities declared him missing, presumed dead. His story faded into the endless list of unsolved disappearances in the Amazon. 2 decades later, in 2023, a team of researchers conducting soil studies along the Rio Purus uncovered something strange: a half-buried metal case, rusted but intact. Inside were a camera and a weathered journal sealed inside plastic bags. Both items were covered in soil and mold, but remarkably preserved. What they revealed would reopen one of the Amazon's most haunting mysteries. Before we dive into Evan's final journey, make sure to subscribe, because this story isn't just about a man who vanished, it's about what he may have discovered before the jungle claimed him. This is Blogger Went Missing While Filming in the Jungle. 20 years later, his camera and journal were found half-buried. Evan Marshall was not a thrill-seeker by nature. He was thoughtful, methodical, and often described by friends as curiously calm. Before his disappearance, he was one of the early pioneers of travel blogging, a time when documenting the world on camera was still considered unusual. His online series, Earth Unfiltered, had built a small but loyal audience fascinated by his ability to find beauty and meaning in remote, often inhospitable places. By mid-2003, Evan had already trekked through deserts in Namibia and climbed ruins in Guatemala. But his next destination was different. The Amazon rainforest had always fascinated him, not for its danger, but for its mystery. In one of his last recorded interviews before leaving the United States, he said, "There are still places on this planet that don't want to be found. That's where I want to go, to listen, not to conquer." Evan's plan was simple but risky. He would fly to Manaus, Brazil, purchase local supplies, hire a small boat, and navigate southward along the Rio Purus. His goal was to reach an uncharted zone referenced in an old travel journal he had come across in a second-hand bookstore, a reference to a silent village deep within the forest, abandoned sometime in the 1940s. The story fascinated him, a settlement that had vanished overnight, leaving only traces of pottery and a name that locals refused to say aloud. He began recording from day one, logging every detail into his handheld camcorder and his written journal. His early footage, recovered from the camera's memory card, shows a man full of purpose. He films the bustling docks of Manaus, narrating over the noise of boats and vendors. His voice is calm, occasionally amused, speaking to an unseen audience about his preparations and fears. Local accounts later confirmed that he stayed 2 nights in a small riverside inn, asking questions about the forest's interior. The innkeeper, an elderly woman named Rosa, would later describe him as polite, quiet, but always writing. She remembered one particular evening when Evan asked her if she had ever heard of the Arowana Path. When she told him it was a place the locals avoided, where the forest eats people, he simply smiled and said, "That's the one." From there, Evan hired a guide named Paulo Silva, a boat operator familiar with the Purus tributaries. Paulo would take him as far as the waterway allowed, about 4 days by motorboat. After that, Evan intended to continue on foot with a map, a compass, and a satellite beacon. The footage from these early days paints a peaceful picture: laughter between the 2 men, long stretches of calm water, and Evan's fascination with the endless walls of green. But there are also small hints of unease. At one point, the camera captures Paulo warning Evan not to continue past a narrow section of the river, saying, "Beyond this, I don't know what's there. The forest changes names. Evan only nods, replying, That's why I came. On July 19, 2003, Paulo dropped him off at a sandbank where the river narrowed. He helped Evan unload his gear, a tent, supplies, the camera, and his journal. In a later interview, Paulo admitted that he offered to wait another day, but Evan insisted he'd be fine. The last footage on the camera from that period shows Evan waving goodbye, then turning toward the forest, camera in hand, saying, Let's find out what's really out here. After that, all communications ceased. His satellite beacon stopped transmitting 2 days later, likely due to damage or battery failure. Search teams would later use Paulo's description and GPS data to trace the location, but dense vegetation and flooding made ground access nearly impossible. In the journal pages recovered from the metal case 20 years later, the first entries mirror his video logs, enthusiastic notes about bird calls, plant species, and the overwhelming humidity. He described sleeping under the thick canopy and waking to what he called a chorus of invisible eyes. But gradually, his tone shifted. Each page revealed shorter, more fragmented thoughts. Mentions of footprints not mine, and voices when the wind stops. The first chapter of Evan's journey began with excitement, but as his notes show, somewhere beyond that final sandbank, something began to change. The forest he admired seemed to grow aware of him, as if it had been waiting for him all along. By the end of July 2003, Evan Marshall had been in the Amazon interior for almost 10 days. According to his recovered notes, the terrain had shifted from navigable marshes to dense, uneven jungle. The heat was relentless, the air thick with insects. He wrote about rationing food earlier than expected because he had misjudged the distances between tributaries. Still, his tone remained positive. The last full entry before his handwriting began to falter described finding remnants of pottery shards and a half-collapsed structure that seemed older than any modern settlement. He believed he had reached the outskirts of the rumored silent village. Audio recovered from the camera paints a clearer timeline. The files were partially degraded, but enough survived for forensic analysts to reconstruct several hours of footage. In them, Evan speaks directly to the camera, his voice slightly strained but steady. He explains that his GPS device had begun to malfunction, possibly due to interference or moisture. He jokes about getting lost in the green, then pauses to mention that he keeps hearing what he calls pattern sounds, not animal noises, but rhythmic tapping, like wood on stone. Experts later suggested that the sounds could have been from falling branches or woodpeckers. Yet Evan's own notes contradict this explanation. On one page he drew a crude diagram showing a ring of marks on nearby trees, evenly spaced incisions, as if cut deliberately. He wrote, "It's too symmetrical for nature." From this point onward, his entries became shorter and more fragmented. Day 12. Compass useless, needle spins. Day 13. Felt watched all night. Day 14. Something moved my pack while I slept. There were no signs of panic, only confusion and fatigue. Investigators later speculated that exposure, dehydration, or local hallucinogenic plants could have distorted his perception. However, the fact that he continued documenting methodically suggests he was still in control of his faculties. On August 1st, his final transmission pinged a location approximately 45 kilometers south of his starting point. When search teams later reached that coordinate, they found nothing, not a campsite, not even a trace of disturbed ground. The region is known for seasonal flooding that can erase signs of human passage within hours. Interviews with locals who live along the Purus tell a different version of events. One hunter claimed that around that same time, he saw campfire smoke deeper within the forest than usual. He assumed it belonged to loggers. Another source, a woman from a nearby indigenous community, told researchers in 2023 that her grandfather once spoke of a man with a light that never died, seen wandering the forest around that period. She believed it referred to Evan's camera lamp. Back in 2003, the official search response was swift but short-lived. The Brazilian civil defense launched aerial scans for 6 days. When no visual contact was made, they turned the case over to local authorities. The area was too vast, the jungle too hostile. After a month, the mission was quietly suspended. Evan's parents flew to Manaus, hoping for answers. They met Paulo Silva, the boat guide, who broke down in tears while describing their last day together. He told them Evan had been determined but calm, carrying more equipment than any single person could manage. Paulo repeated his warning, "The forest changes names," words that would later become symbolic among followers of Evan's story online. For years, the case drifted between speculation and folklore. Internet forums traded theories ranging from animal attack to foul play to paranormal explanations. A few independent explorers even attempted to retrace his path, but none reached far beyond the point where the Purus narrows. The terrain itself seemed to resist intrusion. Then, in early 2023, a university research team studying soil erosion near the same river made a discovery that would reignite global attention. While excavating a test trench, one of the students struck metal. They unearthed a corroded storage case about the size of a shoebox. Inside, wrapped in decayed waterproof lining, were 2 items, a compact camera and a small leather-bound journal. The objects were sent to a laboratory in Manaus for preservation. When digital technicians managed to recover fragments from the camera's memory card, they found roughly 20 minutes of video, most of it damaged, but a few sequences playable. Investigators described the recovered clips as both ordinary and unsettling. They showed Evans sitting near a tree trunk, speaking softly to the camera, explaining that he was trying to find higher ground. His tone is slower than before, his face leaner. Midway through the clip, he glances over his shoulder, pauses, and says quietly, "I think I found what's left of the village." The footage ends abruptly. Forensic examination of the journal revealed more clues. The final pages mention structures of wood arranged like gateways, and symbols carved into bark resembling eyes or suns. His handwriting grows weaker toward the end. The last legible line reads, "If anyone finds this, don't follow my path. It doesn't want to be seen." No further pages were found after that. To this day, no remains have been conclusively identified as Evan Marshall's. His disappearance remains one of the Amazon's most persistent mysteries, a blend of documentary evidence and unanswered questions. As we move deeper into the recovered materials, what emerges is not just the story of a man who vanished, but of a place that seemed determined to erase him. When researchers from the Federal University of Amazonas stumbled upon the small metal case in early 2023, they initially assumed it was old military equipment. The team was mapping soil erosion patterns along a remote section of the Rio Purus when one of the assistants struck a rusted edge buried about half a meter deep. The discovery was logged as routine until the lead researcher, Dr. Helena Duarte, noticed the faint engraving of initials on the case, EM. Once opened, the contents were found remarkably preserved. The camera, though corroded, still had a memory card sealed in its slot, and the leather-bound journal was protected by 2 layers of plastic wrap. Dr. Duarte described the moment she realized the significance of the find as the kind of silence you only hear when history breathes back. The discovery sparked immediate attention. Local authorities were notified, and within days, representatives from Brazil's federal police and international journalists arrived. Evan Marshall's name resurfaced across global media. 2 decades had passed since his disappearance, yet many of his early online followers, now adults with families, vividly remembered his final video upload titled "Deeper into the Unknown." The recovered materials were transported to a climate-controlled lab in Manaus. Specialists from São Paulo and the United States joined the investigation to assist with preservation and data recovery. The camera's battery had long corroded, but digital forensic teams successfully extracted partial video segments. The footage, though degraded, confirmed it was indeed Evans, verified by facial recognition cross-matched with archived content from his blog. The journal, however, proved even more valuable. Forensic analysts noted that the paper fibers matched those manufactured in the early 2000s, and the ink composition aligned with brands Evan was known to use. Every detail of the handwriting was unmistakable. What stood out most was his steady penmanship through most of the book, evidence of discipline, even in extreme isolation. Dr. Duarte's team transcribed the journal entries into digital form. The first half covered known portions of his journey: logistics, weather patterns, wildlife notes. But as the pages progressed, the tone shifted. The language became cryptic, as though Evan was documenting phenomena he didn't fully understand. One entry read, "I found stone markers, 6 of them, evenly spaced, forming a ring, each carved with symbols like eyes. At night they hum, or maybe it's just the insects. The air feels charged." Another stated, "There are voices. They sound like my own recordings played backward." While skeptics dismissed these passages as signs of exhaustion or hallucination, linguists who analyzed his phrasing pointed out something unusual. His syntax changed subtly, incorporating non-English structures resembling an indigenous dialect from the Purus region. Experts debated whether he had encountered locals who influenced his writing or if his mind was deteriorating from isolation. In addition to the text, a small hand-drawn map was found folded into the journal's inner pocket. It showed winding paths and river branches labeled with dates. The final markings circled an area labeled simply as the Hollow. The coordinates were incomplete, but cross-referencing his earlier GPS data placed the location roughly within a 30-kilometer radius from where the metal case was found, suggesting he may have been trying to return when something happened. Following the discovery, the Brazilian government authorized a limited expedition to revisit the area under controlled conditions. The team consisted of forensic geographers, local guides, and 2 members of the National Institute for Space Research, who used drones and thermal imaging to map the terrain. The site was overgrown, almost entirely reclaimed by vegetation, yet aerial scans showed faint geometric anomalies beneath the canopy, shapes too regular to be natural. On the ground, searchers uncovered fragments of wooden posts blackened by age, along with traces of pottery consistent with mid-20th century tribal craftsmanship. Carbon dating later confirmed that the artifacts were approximately 80 years old, aligning with the rumored abandoned settlement Evan had sought. Among the items catalogued was a piece of pottery etched with a repeating symbol resembling an eye within a spiral. When shown this design, local elders recognized it immediately. They called it Alhando que Neodorm, the watching eye. According to their oral history, it represented a guardian spirit tied to forbidden lands where outsiders disappeared. The elders insisted that Evan must have crossed into one of those protected zones, where even locals rarely ventured. Media coverage exploded as details surfaced. Headlines across major outlets called it the lost blogger of the Amazon. Some portrayed Evan as a tragic explorer, others as a cautionary tale about the risks of digital fame. Conspiracy forums reignited with speculation, theories about secret tribes, government cover-ups, and uncontacted civilizations. But among experts, one question dominated: how did the metal case end up half-buried near the riverbank? Geological analysis suggested it had been exposed to multiple flood cycles, implying that it might have drifted from a higher elevation over the years. However, the intact condition of the contents hinted that someone, possibly Evan himself, had deliberately sealed and buried it to protect the materials. The care taken to waterproof the camera and wrap the journal indicated intention, not accident. Dr. Duarte later remarked, "It felt like he wanted someone, someday, to find this, to understand what happened, even if he didn't make it out." The investigation didn't end with the artifacts. Analysis of the camera's video data uncovered a time code gap, evidence of missing footage between the last recovered clip and the previous recording. Forensic technicians found trace data of deleted files, possibly erased manually before the device's power failed. No one could explain who deleted them, or why. What remained, however, was enough to change the direction of the inquiry. Because within the surviving minutes of footage, Evan's final words hinted at something no one expected: a discovery that would lead investigators to re-examine everything they thought they knew about his disappearance. When the first full transcription of Evan Marshall's journal was released to the investigation team, it became immediately clear that his final days in the Amazon were not simply a matter of getting lost. The entries revealed a pattern, a gradual shift from detailed documentation into fragmented symbols, coded phrases, and words written over themselves as though he had been racing against time. The early pages of the recovered section were analytical. He described topographical observations, coordinates, and environmental data. But around what would have been day 15, his tone began to change. He wrote of a clearing that shouldn't exist, and trees arranged in deliberate circles. He noted that when he returned to check the clearing the next morning, the arrangement had changed, as though the forest had moved overnight. Investigators initially attributed these entries to disorientation, a common symptom of isolation in extreme environments. But forensic handwriting analysts noted something more subtle: the precision. His writing remained neat, margins consistent, spacing deliberate. This was not the script of a delirious man. Whatever he was recording, he believed it was real. The most discussed passage in his journal came near the end of his entries. "I followed a path lined with carvings, faces, but not human. Eyes too large, mouths too thin. They watch, not with anger, but with memory. I heard a hum in the soil beneath my feet. It vibrates when I speak." He then sketched an image of a structure resembling a small pyramid of stones partially overgrown by roots. Beneath it, he wrote a single phrase: "They built this for something that listens." Linguistic experts compared drawings and notes with records from regional tribes, but no exact cultural match could be found. However, several ethnographers noted similarities between Evan's sketches and symbols described in 19th-century missionary accounts from the Purus Basin, accounts dismissed at the time as exaggerations. The recovered pages also contain sequences of repeated letters, almost like coded messages: ROTA, ROTA, written vertically, then reversed. Cryptologists suggested it could represent a Latin palindrome, the satyr square, an ancient charm found in European ruins. If accurate, it meant Evan had stumbled upon a symbolic parallel between Old World and New, something scholars found difficult to explain. One of the most perplexing entries came shortly before the final pages. "I am not alone. I have not seen them, but I know they see me. The silence isn't empty. It's listening. I buried my old tapes. If anyone finds this, take them home. Don't let it stay here." Forensic soil analysis later confirmed that the metal case containing his belongings had indeed been buried at a depth consistent with human action. The surrounding soil showed signs of disturbance matching the timeline of his final days. It supported the theory that Evan himself had hidden the case intentionally, knowing he might not survive. Investigators found it remarkable how deliberate his final act appeared. Despite exhaustion, fear, and likely starvation, he had organized his footage, wrapped his notes, and sealed them before hiding them under earth. It suggested he wanted the story, or a warning, to endure. During the documentary review of the case, Dr. Duarte was asked what she believed Evan discovered. Her answer was cautious but revealing. If you read between his lines, you sense he encountered something that altered his understanding of the forest. Not a creature, not necessarily people, but an awareness. The language he uses changes. He stops describing what he sees and begins describing how he is being seen. Asterisk. Digital analysts studying the final sections of the journal noticed faint pressure marks on blank pages following his last entry, as if he had written something and then torn it out. Microscopic imaging revealed partial indentations spelling what appeared to be, "under the roots." That phrase reignited speculation that Evan had discovered ruins, relics, or possibly a burial site he wasn't meant to uncover. Some archaeologists proposed he might have stumbled upon evidence of pre-Columbian civilization not yet documented. Others believed it symbolized something more abstract, perhaps his growing sense that the jungle itself was alive in a way he could not comprehend. When excerpts of the journal were made public, they divided audiences. Rationalists saw a tragic descent into confusion. Mystics saw revelation. The story transcended its original boundaries and became a subject of podcasts, research papers, and online documentaries. But behind the theories, the recovered materials still left investigators with one critical question. If Evan buried his notes and camera, what happened next? Did he attempt to leave the jungle afterward and fail, or did something, or someone, ensure he never left at all? In late 2024, a small investigative team revisited the coordinates indicated in his journal. Using ground-penetrating radar, they detected unusual voids beneath the earth near the area labeled the Hollow. The readings suggested cavities shaped like chambers. Excavation was halted due to legal and environmental restrictions, but the data remained, silent proof that something artificial lay below. The last known note Evan wrote before the entries ended was short, almost serene. The forest doesn't want to harm. It wants to remember. I understand now. That sentence became the closing line of the university's report. But for those who studied the case, it felt less like an ending and more like a message left unfinished. When the forensic team in Manaus completed the digital recovery of Evan Marshall's camera, they expected no more than static, corrupted pixels, or fleeting audio. What they uncovered instead reshaped the timeline of his final days. Out of the 27 total files found on the device, 18 were unreadable, 6 partially viewable, and 3 fully intact. Together, they formed a haunting narrative of isolation, discovery, and something that remains unexplainable to this day. The first intact file, time-stamped July 28, 2003, shows Evan seated beside what appears to be a small mound of earth, speaking quietly to the camera. His face is thin, eyes shadowed by exhaustion, yet his tone is calm, almost reverent. He talks about finding what he calls the markers, describing them as standing stones arranged in a perfect circle around a clearing. He notes that each stone vibrates faintly when touched, though no sound can be heard. He ends the recording saying, "The forest is humming again. It's the same rhythm as the river." The second intact file, dated 2 days later, is shorter, only 3 minutes long. Evan appears disoriented but not panicked. He tells the camera that he's been walking in circles, even though his compass readings suggest otherwise. He points the lens downward to show identical routes appearing in every direction, like patterns repeating themselves. At one point, he pauses and says softly, "It feels like I'm inside something breathing." Analysts noted a background frequency, a low pulse measured at 17 Hz, below the threshold of human hearing but detectable in the recording's waveform. Some researchers suggested it was natural infrasound from wind or water pressure. Others were less certain. The final recording, labeled August 2, 2003, is the most complete and the most unsettling. It runs just over 7 minutes. For the first 4, Evan speaks directly into the camera, describing his intention to leave the area. His voice is weak but deliberate. "If anyone finds this, please return it to my family. The journal explains everything I can't." He then lowers the camera and begins narrating off-screen, describing what he sees. "There are symbols on the trees now. Not carved, grown. They're part of the bark." His voice trembles slightly, though not from fear, more from exhaustion. After a pause, he adds, "I hear something, not near, but under." The footage becomes unstable near the 6-minute mark. The camera appears to tilt, showing the ground, then static lines obscure the image. In the final 30 seconds, a faint sound, rhythmic and mechanical, can be heard beneath the static. It resembles distant breathing or slow drumming. Then Evan's voice returns, almost whispering, "It's not a village. It was never a village." The file ends there. Audio engineers later enhanced the final seconds using spectral analysis. When they isolated the low-frequency pattern, they found it repeated precisely every 22 seconds, a rhythmic consistency rarely produced by nature. Theories emerged suggesting seismic resonance, subsurface water pressure, or even the echo of a nearby waterfall. But the direction of the recorded reverberations didn't match the surrounding topography. It was as if the sound had originated from beneath the camera itself. Despite the clarity of this evidence, the physical environment had changed too much. For direct comparison, flooding, erosion, and decades of ecological growth had altered the landscape beyond recognition. The exact location seen in the videos could not be found again, even with advanced mapping. When the footage was shown to Evan's family privately before any public release, his younger sister described her reaction as grief mixed with understanding. She told reporters later, "He went looking for truth. He found something, but not what he expected. He filmed it so we'd know he didn't just vanish. He saw something the rest of us weren't meant to." Following the release of the documentary analysis in 2024, scientists, historians, and amateur sleuths reignited debates about the Amazon anomaly. Some claimed Evan's discovery could point to a geological phenomenon capable of generating infrasound strong enough to cause hallucinations and disorientation, a plausible explanation for his final writings. Others, particularly local tribes, viewed the recordings differently. To them, the humming Evan described was sacred, the voice of the forest spirit that marks those who cross into forbidden lands. The camera, now preserved in a glass case at the university's anthropology department, remains an object of quiet fascination. Students often remark that when they stand close to it, they feel a faint vibration in the air, a trick of imagination, perhaps, or a remnant of suggestion. Yet one more layer of mystery surfaced in the months following the discovery. A digital archivist reviewing the raw recovery data found traces of an unindexed file, a hidden data segment embedded in the memory card's unused space. When decrypted, it revealed a single frame of video, an unfocused image of the forest canopy with a pale shape barely visible in the background. It was too distorted to identify, not human, not animal, but clearly deliberate. Experts remain divided over whether the image was an accidental fragment or something Evan intentionally captured before the camera's power failed. Whatever the answer, it added a final haunting dimension to the case, a visual echo of the unknown that consumed him. As of today, the investigation into the disappearance of Evan Marshall remains open but inactive. No human remains, no additional artifacts, and no verifiable trace of his last campsite have ever been found. What endures are his words, his lens, and the faint impression that somewhere in the vastness of the Amazon, the forest still remembers the man who tried to understand it. 2 decades after his disappearance, the story of Evan Marshall remains suspended between science and mystery. What began as a simple expedition to document the beauty of the Amazon became a haunting reminder of how little we truly understand about the world's wild places, and about the human need to seek what lies beyond the known. The journal, the camera, and the buried case tell us fragments of a story, but not its ending. Did Evan lose his way in the immensity of the rainforest? Or did he cross into something meant to stay hidden? His last words, "It was never a village," continue to echo through every analysis, every podcast, every late-night discussion among those captivated by his fate. Researchers still debate whether the low-frequency hum in his recordings was a geological anomaly or something else entirely. Locals continue to warn that the forest remembers intruders. And yet, each year, new explorers return to the Purus region, drawn by the same magnetism that pulled Evan into its heart. For those who knew him, Evan's legacy isn't tragedy, it's purpose. He wanted the world to look closer, to listen longer, and to remember that discovery often comes with a cost. If you've watched to the end, take a moment to honor the storytellers who venture where maps end. Because sometimes, the real story isn't about what was found, but about what remains unsolved. This has been Blogger Went Missing While Filming in the Jungle. 20 years later, his camera and journal were found half-buried. Subscribe for more untold stories of disappearances, forgotten evidence, and mysteries that refuse to fade.